Follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And do subscribe our YouTube and Telegram channels. Now let's start our discussion.
Welcome to English Lecture Notes. Today's topic is trauma theory. It is an important field of study because trauma studies conducts research into the psychological consequences of mass trauma, including wars, political violence, torture and natural disasters, and develops effective treatments for survivors. Trauma studies first developed in the 1990s. Psychological trauma, its representation in language, and the role of memory in shaping individual and cultural identities, are the central concerns that define the field of trauma studies. The word trauma literally meant a wound or external body injury, which could be traced back to 17th century medical pathology. Later in the 19th century, the word came to mean psychical trauma. The new sense was the product of Victorian modernity. The effects of trauma were mostly associated with railway accidents and were called railroad spine. Freud's early theories in Studies on Hysteria, 1895, written with Joseph Breuer, and especially his adapted theories later in his career in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920, dominate trauma's conceptual employment by literary trauma critics today. Sigmund Freud is known as the father of psychoanalysis. He showed an interest in traumatic events during two periods, the years between 1892 and 1896. In his studies he examined the causes of hysterical attacks, and the years following World War I. Here he turned his attention to the war neurosis. His original theory postulated actual sexual experiences during infancy and early childhood as the cause of all trauma and the basis for neurosis. In his later work, Freud acknowledged the role of actual experiences in the development of neurosis. According to Freud, traumatic neuroses were caused by real experiences such as accidents, death and combat, whereas anxiety neuroses were mainly the result of sexual and aggressive fantasies, based on early witnessing of the primal scene. In their studies in hysteria, Sigmund Freud and Joseph Breuer suggest that the memory of trauma is more haunting than the traumatic event itself. They meant psychical trauma is more haunting than physical trauma. Psychical trauma has more influence. Freud's theories on traumatic experience and memory define the psychological concepts that guide the field. Psychoanalytic theories regarding the origins and effects of trauma arose in the 19th century study of shock and hysteria by researchers who, in addition to Freud, include Joseph Breuer, Pierre Janet, Jean-Martin Charcot, Hermann Oppenheim, Abram Cardina, and Morton Prince. Freud's early theories in Studies on Hysteria, 1895, written with Joseph Breuer, and especially his adapted theories later in his career in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920, dominate trauma's conceptual employment by literary trauma critics today. Feminism adds a new political dimension to trauma theory. It is in the cases of physical and sexual abuse. A flood of scholarship in the 1990s arose to examine the concept of trauma and its role in literature and society, most prominently by Kathy Caruth, Shoshana Fellman, and Jeffrey Hartman. This is known as first wave of trauma criticism, and it popularized the concept of trauma as an unrepresentable event that revealed the inherent contradictions within language and experience. In the traditional trauma model, pioneered by Kathy Caruth, trauma is viewed as an event that fragments consciousness and prevents direct linguistic representation. The emergence of trauma studies in literary theory, in the 1990s, can be credited to Kathy Caruth's book, Unclaimed Experience, Trauma, Narrative and History, and Kali Thal's Worlds of Hurt, Reading the Literatures of Trauma. In the traditional trauma model pioneered by Kathy Caruth, Trauma is viewed as an event that fragments consciousness and prevents direct linguistic representation. This model emphasizes the suffering caused by an external source that makes internal changes to the mind and irreversibly changes identity. It draws attention to the severity of suffering by suggesting the traumatic experience permanently damages the psyche. Trauma is a distinct event that shatters identity and remains outside normal memory and narrative representation. Traumatic experience and its inherent dissociation prevent the application of determinate value to that experience, because the level of fright destroys the mind's ability to comprehend it and linguistically code it. Although the experience may never be narrated clearly, it acts like a tumor in consciousness that wounds the self. The traumatic experience exerts a negative and frequently pathological effect on consciousness and memory. The suffering caused by an external source makes internal changes to the mind and irreversibly changes identity. It is causing lasting damage and demanding unique narrative expressions. Trauma's strange absence, yet ghost-like presence in consciousness, its lack of normal integration into memory and narration, casts a shadow that indirectly points toward trauma's meaning and the truth of the past. This trauma model figures most prominently in Kathy Caruth's Unclaimed Experience, Trauma Narrative History, 1996, which takes a particular interpretation of Freud's trauma theories to forward a larger post-structural concern with the referential limits of language and history. Caruth argues that trauma's concealment and dissociation disrupts the ability to fully understand or represent a traumatic experience. Caruth argues that trauma is not locatable in the simple violent or original event in the individual's past, but only identified in the way it is precisely not known in the first instance, returns to haunt the survivor later on. Trauma produces a double paradox in consciousness and language. Caruth also relies on a neurobiological approach to explain trauma's effect on consciousness and memory, particularly the work of psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk, who argues that the neurobiological response to trauma elicits a universal response, a speechless terror, that forecloses the possibility of narrative recall in memory, since the event cannot be organized on a linguistic level. Scholars like Caruth pioneered a psychoanalytic and post-structural approach that suggests trauma as an unsolvable problem of the unconscious that illuminates the inherent contradictions of experience and language. The American Psychiatric Association has recognized traumatic experiences and their effects under the title Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, PTSD. Kathy Caruth defines trauma as an overwhelming experience of sudden or catastrophic events, in which the response to the event occurs in the often delayed, defining trauma's effects on identity and memory, as an interplay of external and internal forces, as well as individual character traits and cultural factors, creates a broader appreciation for the links between the singular and collective traumatic experience. The processes of memory remain central to the depiction of trauma's impact. Caruth understands trauma in terms of the dynamic relationship between the event and its witness, that the structure of the experience and the reception of the event. The event returns in the form of dream, a nightmare, hallucinations, etc. The fact that trauma resides in the unconscious complicates the concept of witness. The witness has no control over the coming back of the event from unconscious mind. Just like Freudian dream, the symptoms of the trauma can also have two types of contents, that is, a manifest content and the latent content. The field of trauma studies continues to develop and adapt the foundational post-structural approach, as well as incorporate new perspectives from post-colonialism, feminist theory, ethnic studies, and eco-criticism in scholarship that examines trauma's significance in literature and society. Recent collections such as Contemporary Approaches in Literary Trauma Theory and The Future of Trauma Theory include further exploration of sociocultural and semiotic implications of trauma in literature. The breadth of current criticism provides to the versatility of trauma studies and its relevance to literary theory.
That's all for today. If you find this video informative, please do subscribe our channel and don't forget to click the bell icon to get the notification of our coming videos. Thank you for watching.